In the 17th century, there were some important developments related to how people thought about society and culture, and even how people thought about human beings. There are a lot of philosophical developments we could talk about, but I'm just going to mention two because of the impact that they had. First is the philosophy of René Descartes. Descartes was educated by Jesuits, so the Catholic education there, but he had really been influenced by the certainty of mathematics, as a lot of these early philosophers were, these early modern philosophers were. And he wanted to figure out if there was a method that could be used to take the certainty of mathematics and provide the same kind of certainty philosophically. What kind of things could we be certain about? Right? How do I define reality and know that it's real? And so, according to his writings, he claimed to have started by saying, all right, I'm going to refuse to believe anything unless it's decisively shown to be true. I'm going to refuse to believe anything exists until I can be certain that it is absolutely true. So I'm going to doubt everything. But it's in this doubting, Descartes says, that I discovered that there must be something or someone to do the doubting. How can I doubt if I don't exist? And out of that is where Descartes develops that rather famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. Right? I am the one that has these doubts. I think about these doubts. Therefore, I can know that I exist. And I can distinctly perceive that I exist, and I distinctly perceive the existence of things around me. So if I can clearly and distinctly perceive something, it must exist as well, which allows him to say reality as we perceive it, or not as we perceive it, but reality. There must be things to exist in reality as well. But perceptions can be misleading. The sun does not look like a globe or a sphere. It looks like a disk. But it is a sphere. But it's still, there is something there because I can clearly perceive it. He's also important religiously because of his using this method and then bringing in that ontological argument to prove the existence of God. Who could have imagined God, Descartes argues, unless God existed? And so that idea of the perfect being, I can conceive of a being of which there is none greater. Essentially, the system developed by Descartes and then picked up by other philosophers is referred to as rationalism, because of this confidence in the rational powers of human beings. I can use reason to understand the world around me. In contrast to the rationalism of Descartes, there was the philosophical system of John Locke. Locke was the son of a country attorney who had taken a classical education, was interested in medicine and the experimental sciences as they were developing, and becomes especially interested in political philosophy and writes several works on political philosophy. Ultimately, Locke says, this notion that we have ideas in our mind innately, that we are born with conceptions, and that's how we understand and categorize the world, that's false. Instead, we don't have innate ideas. We are a blank slate. Right? We're born without innate ideas. We're born without structures in our mind to organize the world. But instead, as we perceive the world through our senses, we develop ideas. And so his philosophical outlook is known as empiricism. Right? We're encountering things through our senses. Now that notion of the blank slate and the census will become important for a lot of Protestant theology and philosophy, but there are other aspects to Locke's thinking that are also important religiously. Reason and judgment, said Locke, must be used to examine faith. Right? And so this emphasis on faith being reasonable. He also advocated for religious toleration. One of his documents, one of his writings, a rather short document compared to some of his others, was on religious toleration. The state should not limit freedom of religion because religion, said Locke, is a personal decision. It's based on the conscience. And so the conscience shouldn't be forced. So the church should only have the power to persuade, not to force people on what to believe. In his political thought and philosophy, Locke is still deeply influenced by Christianity, but with his emphasis on empiricism, on this blank slate notion, he's providing a way for people to question Christianity and its role in government. Locke's important for other things as well, the notion of social contracts, the idea of the consent of the government, or excuse me, the consent of the governed, as well as the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, which Thomas Jefferson changes for the Declaration of Independence into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Locke has said life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Also important culturally is that continued development of modern science. There are two developments I want to mention here. First, of course, is the work of Galileo. Born in Pisa, Italy, he had kind of used Copernicus's work on a heliocentric solar system and extended it. In fact, it was Galileo who confirmed Copernicus's findings through the use of a telescope, and because of that, he was condemned by the Inquisition. Galileo, of course, is also known as the founder of modern physics, but from a Christian standpoint, his findings made him question whether the church hierarchy had the ability to evaluate scientific matters, because they were stating against what was scientifically obvious to Galileo, right? That the earth revolved around the sun. So how can how can the church, especially the priests, the bishops, how can they make those decisions when they are not qualified to evaluate them properly? And so the church shouldn't speak in scientific matters unless the particular individual has had training. He is prohibited from writing or speaking about his discoveries by the church, and eventually placed under house arrest because he would continue to promote his discoveries. But it's this split that's developed between science and Christianity, because traditional views of Christianity regarding how the earth revolves around the sun, right, and all those kind of things are being challenged by science. So again, Galileo coming from a Christian standpoint, but the things he's discovering are further splitting science and religion. Things went a little bit differently for the English Francis Bacon. Bacon wasn't so much interested in the solar system, but he was interested in what kind of method or approach can be developed to lead to scientific discovery. And so Bacon ultimately came on the approach known as the inductive method, where you would investigate facts in the world around you, nature around you, and out of those facts, you would then draw theories. Previous generations had approached it the other way. They developed theories of how the world worked and then set about trying to find facts that would uphold those theories. Now, how does that matter? Well, Reformed Protestants, especially the Puritans, become fascinated with Bacon's approach, even though it's not specifically theological. He's just talking about how do we understand nature and how nature works. But out of Bacon's ideas and other English natural philosophers or early modern scientists, they're developing this notion of having dominion over nature. We can control nature as we discover how it works. We can improve nature. So you have this scientific method that helps you understand nature, and then you also have this verse from Genesis chapter 1 that talks about God granting dominion over the earth to Adam and Eve. And so the Puritans especially thought that as Christians understood and conquered nature, they were coming closer to inaugurating the kingdom of God. And so it becomes a theological, or it has theological consequences because of how it gets used by other people outside of Bacon. In the context of culture and society, we can talk about other things, art, music, and this is the time of Johann Sebastian Bach, and a lot of other things as well, but regarding what are known as the arts, I just want to spend some time talking about literature. Important developments in literature during this time. We've already talked about one, the King James Version. Right? It's not just an important translation, it's a good piece of literary achievement. Some people have said it is the best work ever done by a committee because it was translated by a group of people. Usually committee work doesn't end up being that great, but the literacy, or the literary qualities, that's what it's looking for, the literary qualities of the King James Version for the time, and even now, 400 years later, mark it as an important achievement of the time period. But that's not the only one. There's also the works of John Milton. John Milton was the son of a Protestant composer also named John Milton. He studied languages, traveled in Europe, graduated from Cambridge in 1632, and had been preparing to be an Anglican priest, but he would later abandon that desire and begins writing poetry. Becomes very supportive of Cromwell and Puritanism, and also becomes a governmental secretary. During this time, he goes blind. And so he continues writing, but it's having to talk to other people about it. His most famous work religiously is Paradise Lost, published in 1667. It is a poetic account of the fall of Adam and Eve, in which Milton's trying to make sense of providence. How does providence work? Often, a lot of what we think about hell and Satan are more influenced by Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost than they are by what the Bible says. And so it becomes influential that way. The work starts out with, the work essentially presents Satan as kind of this hero or an anti-hero at the least. It starts off with the aftermath of war in heaven that leads to Satan and his angels being cast out. Satan plans to get back at God, but not through going back to heaven, but through getting at human beings on earth. And according to Paradise Lost, he makes several attempts to secretly convince Eve to eat of the tree before appearing as a serpent, and Adam is also persuaded to eat. The Son appears in order to judge Adam and Eve, and other works talk about Satan, the aftermath of all of that. At the end of the book, the Archangel Michael shows Adam biblical history leading up to the work of Christ. Right, so he's given this future view, but then also from that time to the end of time, the final judgment. A very important work that shapes a lot of thinking, both religiously and elsewhere. Milton, though, probably wasn't strictly orthodox. He may have denied the Trinity. He may have denied that Jesus was God. It's a little unclear. But he did push for religious freedom and tolerance as well. Another important work of the time is by John Bunyan. His famous work, is Pilgrim's Progress. The full title is The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to that which is to come. Since the 17th century, it has been translated into several hundred languages and has never been out of print. Bunyan grew up a Puritan, served in Parliament's army during the Civil War, would eventually join a Baptist church and begin preaching. Because he would be preaching without a license, he would be imprisoned. Pilgrim's Progress is presented as a dream, and it's the pilgrimage of a character named Christian from the city of destruction through places like Vanity Fair, the Delectable Mountains, before arriving at the Celestial City. Through that progress, the pilgrimage, he meets a variety of characters. His companions are named Faithful and Hopeful. He meets Mr. Worldly Wiseman, Lord Hategood, Mr. Standfast, and Mr. Valiant for Truth. Ultimately, of course, it's an allegory for the Christian life and the various things people will face on their Christian walk. Ultimately, and the message is, let go of your sin and guilt. Don't get distracted by various things, people, places around us, and focus on heaven.